Okay guys, today we're going to be painting Chaos Terminators, or at least one. And we're using some else stuff. Unfortunately, we're not going to be covering how we did this base. We'll do that in a different video. But here we go. Okay, so I'm going to start with a Zenithal Prime. Obviously, I'm going to undercoat in black because I want to keep all those dark areas nice and dark. But I'm going to come in here with some titanium white ink and build up the highlights. As you can see, everything gets a rough sort of grey from the top, and then I start sharpening in where I want those details, and they get brighter and brighter wherever I want the focus of the model to be. Now I'm using Leviathan Purple, nice contrast paint, just to get into those shadowed areas, because we're going to come back and cover everything, but this is just going to give them a little bit of life. So as on the opposite side of that, we've got a nice sort of cold shadow. We're going to have a nice brighter, slightly warmer highlight, Fire Dragon Bright, into those most of those white areas, and then we're going to do the entire model in Flesh Tearers Red. And as you can see here, I'm going fairly heavily, but I'm letting some of those colours from underneath come through. I don't want to start blocking them out, and we get a really good sense of volume on, and some colour interest on the armour panels now. Obviously you can do all this with dry brushes and normal brushes and contrast paints, but it's just a lot faster with the airbrush. Now I'm using dark aluminium, and the reason I'm using dark aluminium is because it's just a little bit darker and it flows a little bit better, and I want consistency across all of these metallic parts. So I'm doing it on the helmet here, but I'm also using it for the edging of the pauldrons and stuff, which you'll see in a little minute, but I want them to be consistent. Using Black Legion contrast paint for the dark under areas of the armor, and also for the little torn up loincloth that he has, because I want the parts that we've already painted with those shadows and that little bit of Flesh Tearers Red, I want those little colours to just subtly come through the contrast paint, but not too much. So that's just a nice use of contrast paint there, keeping those undercolours popping through ever so subtly, so the model just ties together really nicely. Obviously being very careful not to cover up or get onto any of the armour panels that we've already painted, because it's going to be very difficult to fix those later. And as you can see here with the dark aluminium, it just flows really nicely onto all these really complicated little edgings that the Chaos Marines have, and I want them to be consistent with across the model. So keeping away from the lead belcher just makes this a little bit easier, I think. And obviously this is the most time consuming part of painting any Chaos Marine, so I want to try and save as much time as we can in other areas. That's why I use the airbrush. And then all of these fiddly little bits that we have to be super careful with. And then obviously here you can see I'm painting his big ass power sword. Same dark aluminium. We're going to darken these up later with a little bit of Nuln Oil. Good old Nuln Oil. There. And I'm actually painting the skull here. I'm going to come back and colour it with some actual bone colour, but I want the dark aluminium because it's slightly brighter. It's going to be easier to cover that later with any bone coloured paint than it is to put that darker red. Now some Retributor armour just onto some of these tiny gold details. There aren't actually that many on this model, or they weren't the way I painted it. I'm sure you could, if you did all of the edging in gold, this would be way more time consuming, but it's just these little parts on the weapon and the hilt, and some of those rounds going into the weapon as well. So here, just being careful, but this wouldn't be too difficult to fix with the dark aluminium, but if I get this on the armor accidentally, we're going to have a real problem. Now I'm using some Steel Legion drab, and if I remember correctly, I actually darkened this up just a slight amount with a slightly darker brown. I was painting these little sticks and spears that are coming out of the top of his shoulders. And I'm not going to do too much for it. It's quite flat because I want the other parts of these to be the details that we see. Now I'm using Ushabti bone on all the skulls, on his shoulders, and I'm being careful here because again I don't want to ruin anything, but with this I'm not actually going to go and be too picky about putting in two coats, because those colours that we've already put in, the reds and the dark colours, they're going to give some nice shading to these skulls and a nice little bit of interest, and they'll look a little bit dirtier in more interesting ways. I'm also painting the tusks, horns, whatever you want to call them, on the helmet, because I went with a normal sort of uncovered head for the captain of this squad, as you can see here, which I'm painting in pale flesh, but But I thought, you know what? Maybe he's carrying his helmet with him. He just got a bit warm, and he's taking his helmet off and hanging it on the back of his armor. So you'll see that when I stick it on later. But here, pale flesh onto the whole head. There we go. Now, titanium white I'm using just for some of those little details that we're going to pick out with interesting colours later, just to add some points of focus. But here on his helmet, I'm going into the eyes, just being very careful not to get it on the armour. Then Berserker Bloodshade I'm using for the flesh, because I want him to have that more sickly, pallid feel, with a bit more flesh coming through, rather than just a normal dark brown. Now, Seraphim Sepia, oh sorry, actually what I'm doing here is just painting the eyes in a fluorescent green, but not to worry. And Seraphim Sepia, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to paint onto these tusks. I'm going to paint the entire tusk and all of the bones in Seraphim Sepia. And then Black Legion, just for the face mask and whatnot. And with the paleness of the flesh and the darkness of this face mask, there's a lot of contrast in the centre there, so he really draws your attention to his face. Now, Macragge Blue, I'm going to paint this helmet on his shoulder. You could paint this any colour you wanted. You could do any Space Marine faction, Legion that you wanted. But Macragge Blue, I think the blue just stands out really nicely against that red. If you had yellow, I think it'd be a bit too bright, and anything red would obviously be lost against it. Now, Ryclone Flesh Shade, I'm going into the tusks again now that the Seraphim Sepia is dry, and I'm not going all the way up. I'm covering the sort of the bottom 3/4 or 2/3 in Ryclone Flesh Shade. These are all fairly watered down because I don't want them to build up too much and fill in those details. It'd be more difficult to pick out the highlights later, which we'll do using the original Ashabti bone. And you can see there, Ryclone Flesh Shade into the skull on the hilt as well. And I do get into all the shoulders there. And then that combined with those shadows just gives us some nice colour interest without having to do too much strenuous work. And now Agrax Earthshade, I'm just going to the very base of the tusks and the horns, and I'm actually leaving the skulls alone with this because I feel that they'll be a little bit cleaner, whereas these horns want to look a bit more aged. So just a close up here, you can see just on the very edges, so I get that slightly darker feel. And then once all that's dry, I'll come back and give them all a light brushing with some Ashabti bone. Now I'm using black panel liner here. Now normally what I would do is I would coat the whole thing in matte varnish so I get a nice clean line to all these edges, but because they're Chaos Marines, I feel like they've got a little bit more grit to them. So leaving the paint unvarnished, using the panel liner and getting into those edges, I actually get a nice spread into some of the porous areas that we worked up, so it gives it a bit more grit and feel. Null now onto all of those metal parts, sword, and the dark aluminium areas on the shoulders. And then what I'm doing is, because I've watered this down a little bit as well, it sort of does bleed into the shoulder pads a little bit, which brings it into the panel liner, so we get a nice passage between the two, nice merge between the two. A little bit of watered down Dark Reaper, don't really go into the Edge Highland, but this loincloth really does need a little bit of volume, so because it's such a big area. So just getting some of the higher points of that with the Dark Reaper, so it just gives it a little bit of life, bring out some of those highlights, and it works nicely with the darker undercoloured red shadows. I'm using Stormhost Silver here just for the edge of the weapon and that sword, just to make it look a little sharper, a little cleaner, like it's seen some use. Just being careful not to cover up any of the areas that we've already got with Nuln Oil on the sides. There we go. And then last but not least, just to add in a little bit of weathering and to break up some of those panels a little bit, a very light dry brushing and a little bit of stippling with some dry neck-on compound. Magic in a bottle, really. And as you can see there, the base going for a lava field, but didn't include in the video. We'll do another video about that. But there he is, all in his chaotic glory, ready to bring the warp and destroy the Grimdark future.